Hello, Spring Lake villagers. This is Nick again. Week two of our series on the rise of the women's movement in the UK and the United States. So last week we devoted one lecture to the rise of the suffragette movement. We distinguished between sort of the early wave of the women's movement in the UK with the suffragists, and the second wave of suffragettes. And I mentioned in the last lecture how much the role of women in the UK, the rise of that movement would impact the development of the women's movement in the United States. I discovered that PBS has been running a couple of documentaries one on the suffragist movement and the second on the evolution of the women's movement in the United States. The second one is called Vote. I haven't had a chance to see either documentary. Maybe some of you have caught one or the other, or even both. The reviews that I've read say they're quite good. So if they're still running on either there are two local PBS stations in our area. You might want to check them out. This week now we're going to turn to the rise of the women's movement, the struggle for the right to vote in the United States. And our lecture is entitled Quakers, Reformers, and Abolitionists on the Road to Seneca Falls. During the Enlightenment, that great intellectual and philosophical movement that swept across Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries, a movement in which politics, philosophy, science, the nature of God, the nature of man were radically being reoriented. Very revolutionary ideas were being discussed in the great salons, in the bars of Paris and London and Vienna. Very explosive ideas. And one of the most radical was the idea of granting the right to vote to all, not only men, but to women as well. And already we find in the American colonies in the second half of the 18th century, we find women already voting. So colonies, I should say this, because this was already occurring in the American colonies, but in New Jersey, women actually were voting. Not all women, but women who held a certain amount of property, specifically 50 pounds, were voting in various counties throughout New Jersey. And even after the end of the American Revolution in 1781, women were taking part in various elections. In fact, in some instances, they were determining the outcome in some heavily contested elections, and their vote would really determine the outcome. So they earned the title, these women who were voting in states like New Jersey, the petticoat electors. So, as you know, the American Constitution created the electoral college system with electors from each state, and women now were seen as electors in certain election cycles, during certain election cycles. The frequency of women voting, even 25, 30 years after the American Revolution, caused the state of New Jersey to disenfranchise, to pass legislation that would not allow women nor African American individuals to vote in elections. So by the early 19th century, the first 19th century, women were not voting at all. But women would play a very tangible role in educating the citizenry about the virtuous role each individual had to play in the young republic. And even though women and African Americans, slaves in particular, were barred from voting, the idea of the virtuous citizen took hold. And women, more than anything else, took center stage. And they were given the lofty title of a Republican mother. That is, one who would be integral in inculcating Republican values in their children, the idea of them going on to becoming virtuous, enlightened citizens that would play a major role in the young republic. So the woman was seen as espousing, champion the loftiest ideals, the time honored traditions of a Republican form of government within the family unit. So citizenship and voting would go hand in hand. And to this end, schools would be established that would educate a new generation of pupils who'd go on to become responsible, virtuous citizens in the American system of government. And women would play a center role in elementary education. This was a major event that took place, the need for good schools, good schooling to inculcate and train the subsequent generations of Americans. And it grew out in particular of the Industrial Revolution, when we see a rise of an urban middle class women educated at home who would very much be caught up in moral reform. And what we discover is that the women's movement, as it progresses in the 19th century, is really an outgrowth of the temperance movement, something we discuss when we discuss the temperance movement, and in particular, the abolition movement, as well. The push for women to play a more activist role in the body politic and secure more freedoms would not have been possible were it not for the Quakers. The Quakers were a religious sect, also known as the Society of Friends, that began in England. Sometime around 1652, an itinerant preacher and missionary by the name of George Fox, see him there in the right-hand corner, went on a spiritual journey. He was very much attuned to the social ills that were plaguing England at the time, and he was deeply troubled by what he saw. And he also encountered a number of people who did not have a favorable view of women. In fact, women were regarded as no more than a goose. This pejorative would be associated with Quakers who took part in the women's movement in the early years of the American Republic. The Quakers believed in the egalitarian role of women in society. They believed that God dwelt in all of God's creation, including women, and women were encouraged to speak up and express their opinion. Although within the hierarchy of the Quaker religion, if there was a hierarchy, so to speak, women did not enjoy the status of elders, but they were encouraged to take part in speaking, in missionary work. They took a a very prominent role in the education of children and spreading the Christian message. Quakers had a very progressive view regarding women at a time when other Protestant sects, and Quakerism was a sort of an offshoot of the Puritan movement, and like so many unorthodox sects, persecuted sects, they would thrive in the Americas. And so Quakerism took root in the American colonies already in the 17th century and spread in much of areas, in particular in Pennsylvania, but in other parts of the Northeast. Quakers, as I mentioned, put a strong emphasis on education, especially the education of women. Women were encouraged to read and write. They were encouraged to be part of church committees and take a role in decision making and voting that took place within the church itself. So again, we have this very egalitarian sort of view, this progressive view regarding the role of women. Women also were missionaries, and they spread the Christian message in various public venues. So they had experience expressing their view. And the Quakers, as we've mentioned in previous lecture series, the Quaker movement, the Society of Friends, played a very prominent role in other great social reforms, in particular the temperance movement, as we discussed in a previous lecture, and also in the anti-slavery movement and abolitionism, as we discussed earlier. And we have to see the women's movement as sort of an offshoot of these other great social movements, in particular abolitionism. So many prominent Quaker women, as we shall see, were very much at the forefront of not only the women's movement, but in the temperance movement, as well as the abolition movement. The women's movement really began to take off in the 1830s as abolitionism was underway. So as I mentioned, many women who took part in anti-slavery movements, even participating alongside men in the establishment of anti-slavery societies, they saw themselves also as sort of the early pioneers of the women's movement. So once again, in understanding the rise of the women's movement in the United States, you must see it again as sort of an offshoot of what was taking place in the abolition movement. So women and men railed against the dark side of slavery and called for more rights, not only on behalf of African Americans, but also for women. But whereas men had respect in the marketplace of ideas, women did not enjoy the same. In fact, many were vilified and were ridiculed. One of the great abolitionists and feminists of the era was Frances Wright, better known as Fanny Wright. She was born in Scotland, where she had already made a name for herself as a lecturer, a writer of many manuals that called for social reform. She was regarded as a free thinker, a feminist, and a utopian socialist, as well as an abolitionist. She came to the United States around 1825, and in that same year, she established her utopia, a commune in Tennessee called Neshoba. And it was one of these early utopian communities that showed how people could live together of various creeds and backgrounds. It also included a number of slaves who were being educated in preparation for their eventual emancipation. The project only lasted a few years, but Fanny Wright would go on and become a very noted public lecturer. But unfortunately, like many of her female counterparts who were had public acknowledgement and who were active both in the anti-slavery movement and the women's movement, they were often derided and attacked. And this descriptor of a goose, describing them as one who behaves like a goose, this derogatory epithet was also attached to Fanny herself every time she spoke in public. In fact, one cartoonist said she deserves to be hissed. So his message basically is she may hold a certain opinion, but she should not be allowed in any way to express her opinions in public. Despite this kind of calumny, Fanny would not be stopped, not be in any way deterred in her efforts to bring about reform. And again, she would play a very prominent role in calling for the emancipation of slaves. But she was also, interestingly enough, an early advocate of birth control, sexual freedom, legal rights for married women, and very liberal divorce laws. And Wright was also very vocal in her opposition to organized religion and capital punishment. So the clergy and the press were so enraged by her celebrity and her success in voicing her opinion and championing her causes. She was even more harshly criticized for her radical views. Many of her public lectures led to the establishment of Fanny Wright societies and her association with the Working Man's Party in New York City in 1829 became so strong that the opponents of this movement called the party's slate of candidates the Fanny Wright ticket. We mentioned the role that Quaker women played early on, and there were a number of Quaker women who would play a leading role in the movement already in the 1830s. One of these was the Quaker minister, Lucretia Mott, who came from a privileged upper middle class family. She began as an abolitionist, but later became one of the great feminists calling for women's right to vote. In addition, there were the Gremke sisters, Sarah and Angelina Gremke. They came from, again, a well-to-do family, but a slave-holding family in South Carolina. Their father was a strong advocate of slavery and in no way a champion of women's rights. Nevertheless, his progressive-minded daughters became very strong advocates of the abolition movement and women's rights. They were speakers, writers, and educators. They moved to the North in the 1820s and spent some time in Philadelphia, becoming part of a substantial Quaker community just outside Philadelphia. As I mentioned, very active in the abolitionist movement, traveling on the lecture circuit and recounting their firsthand experiences with slavery on their family's plantation. They were fiercely attacked for lecturing before mixed audiences. That would include an audience made up of both black and white, and men and women. And this horrified many conservative clerics who regarded this grouping of the races, and especially the grouping of the sexes, as something very promiscuous. Many religious organizations attacked their behavior as unseemly, behavior that in no way comported with that of women. And we find the Massachusetts Council of Congregational Ministers issuing a pastoral letter in the 1830s, 1837, railing against their activity. But the women were not to be stopped. They continued to emphasize the importance of women in the abolitionist movement. And so we once again see the important role Quaker women such as Lucretia Mott and the Grimke sisters played, not only in the anti-slavery movement, but the women's right movement in the first half of the 19th century. The great African-American abolitionist Frederick Douglass would participate not only in the abolition movement, but also in the women's movement. He believed in many of the Enlightenment ideals, egalitarian ideas, ideals of universal suffrage, not only for all men, and in particular the African Americans he was defending and hoping for the eventual emancipation of slaves and the right to vote, but also for women to vote as well. So we find many of these early pioneers of the women's movement not only finding their voice, playing very activist roles in social reform, becoming noted writers, organizers, community organizers, lecturers, but gaining that necessary experience so essential to the women's movement in the 19th century. The World Anti-Slavery Conference, which was held in London in 1840, is often cited by historians as the beginning of the suffrage movement in the United States. At that famous conference, there were a number of prominent attendees from the United States, including the famous social reformer Henry Stanton and his wife Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Also present at that conference was Lucretia Mott, whom we've already met, the famous Quaker reformer and minister. And there were several other women representatives from the United States. Upon making the arduous and long journey to London, the women were treated shabbily. They were not permitted to participate in the convention. They were not allowed to attend the meeting hall. They were relegated to the gallery. This so incensed Mott and Katie Stanton that they decided they would hold their own convention 8 years later at Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848. And it's this convention that's seen as the great watershed moment, the great landmark in the history of the women's movement in the United States. Uh, the women at Seneca Falls were absolutely blown over when some 40 men attended among the 300 attendees, as well as the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass himself. So as we've seen in the 1840s, women who gained experience in the abolitionist movement would become leaders of the emerging women's rights movement. And they wanted to address a number of laws that were on the books in various states throughout the United States, still a relatively young country, especially the laws of coverture, which were still in place. At the time, husbands controlled family finances, including the finances of women, children, and property. Women did not have equal access to education. During that era, a number of states were repealing laws that required voters to own land, which increased the number of white male voters, but women were not allowed to cast the vote. So at the opening of the meeting, Elizabeth Stanton began to read the Declaration of Sentiments, which she herself had written. In it, she asserted all men and women are created equal, again, echoing the famous words in Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. By asserting this, she was making very provocative statement at the time. So the Declaration of Sentiments, as penned by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, called for a long list of women's rights, including access to education and job opportunities, more power within the church, and the right to control one's own property and money. Many of the resolutions were approved unanimously. There were also some very unorthodox ideas that were sort of in opposition to the cult of true womanhood. And a lot of these go back to the early days of the Republic, again, the Republican mother, as we discussed at the beginning of the lecture. The so-called cult of true womanhood that included piety, purity, submission, and domesticity. So this sort of throwback to the way women should behave was sort of attacked, vilified as sort of an antiquated view of the role of women. And so therefore, the Declaration of Sentiments would assert women authority, women's power, and desire to seek many greater rights. So the Seneca Falls Convention, held in New York in 1848, again, that great watershed moment in the women's movement, was an enormous success, and it would lead to subsequent conventions on behalf of women, the next of which would be held just 2 years later in 1850. 2 years after Seneca Falls in 1850, the first in a series of national women's conventions were held, the first of which was in Worcester, Massachusetts. What we discover at many of these yearly conventions is that women were not necessarily on the same page. Oftentimes, this movement was very fractious and very unruly, but women were very much on the same page as regards lack of education, um, economic mobility, laws of coverture, etc. One of the main ways in disseminating what was going on in the women's movement and getting the word out was the publication of various feminist tracts, the most famous of which was The Lily, whose publisher was Amelia Bloomer. Bloomer's publication, as well as many others, kept the women's movement afoot. Many various ideas were discussed in the pages of these publications. There were various tracts and a number of recommendations of how women could hone their forensic skills, ways in which they could attract attention and bigger audiences, etc., how they could go about canvassing for new recruits, etc. Now, during this period, perhaps the most famous woman in the history of the women's movement emerges. And of course, that was Susan B. Anthony, a teacher from Massachusetts, a Quaker, as so many of these protagonists in the women's movement were, one who had already been very active in both the temperance as well as the abolitionist movement. And like so many of her compatriots, she very much solicited politicians and state legislatures to end laws of coverture, give women more say in property rights, decisions over their children, and enact more liberal laws regarding divorce. So as a champion of not only women's rights, but also temperance, abolition, the rights of labor, equal pay for equal work, Susan B., and that B stands for Brownell, Susan Brownell Anthony would really emerge as perhaps the most visible leader of the suffrage movement. Along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she traveled around the country and delivered speeches in favor of women's suffrage. She came, like so many of the women in this movement, from quite a prominent family in Massachusetts. Her father was a farmer and a very successful cotton mill owner and manager. And from an early age, Anthony really was inspired by that Quaker belief that everyone was equal under God. All individuals, black, white, male, female, were all equal in the eyes of God. And this idea would guide her throughout her life. She herself had 7 brothers and sisters, many of whom also became activists for justice, social reform, and the emancipation of slaves. In 1854, Susan B. Anthony was very successful in organizing a petition drive, and she was even able to obtain hearing before the New York state legislature. And at that hearing, Elizabeth Cady Stanton addressed the alliance, and at the time established a lifelong friendship with Susan B. Anthony that would last some 50 years. This collaboration was epic in the history of the women's movement. So their decades-long collaboration was very pivotal for the suffrage movement and contributed significantly to the broader struggle for women's rights, which Stanton herself called the greatest revolution the world has ever known and ever will know. The two of them complemented one another. Each of them had their own special skill sets. Anthony was superb at organizing, but Stanton had a great aptitude for intellectual matters and publication. Stanton was homebound with quite a number of children during this period and wrote speeches that Susan B. Anthony delivered to meetings that she herself organized. So Anthony, who, as you know, became the person most closely associated with the women's movement, would later say in life, at the time, I wasn't really ready to vote. I didn't want to vote, but I did want equal pay for equal work. And in this very important chapter just before the Civil War, Anthony would give priority to the abolitionist movement. So as we've seen, of course, the early women's rights movement would include both African American and mostly upper middle class white Protestant women, as well as men. But one should not think that both Black and white women were always on the same page. A lot of times they came to heads with one another, and white women were accused of ignoring the rights African American women were espousing. African Americans claimed that white women did not understand their experience and that they were not really the ones who could successfully voice the plight of African American women. In 1851, at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention, the famous Black suffragette Sojourner Truth spoke about equal rights for Black women. Reporters at the convention published a number of transcripts of the speech where she used the now famous rhetorical question, "Ain't I a woman?" to point out the discrimination she herself experienced as a Black woman. She would go on to meet with the other famous leading right activists, Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. This speech, of course, became her most famous, though it was just one of many that she would use to advocate for human rights the rest of her life. Like so many other famous escaped slaves, one thinks of Harriet Tubman, Truth would help recruit Black soldiers during the Civil War. She worked in Washington, D.C. for the National Freedmen's Relief Association and rallied people to donate food, clothing, and other supplies to Black refugees. Her activism for the abolitionist movement would gained the attention of President Lincoln, who invited her to the White House in October 1864 and showed her a Bible that had been given to him by African Americans in Baltimore. After the Civil War, we'll see a real rift that emerges between Black abolitionists and many of the prominent feminists of the women's movement, especially certain white women who themselves did not hold the same convictions regarding the equality of Black women as regards voting rights, etc. Over Anthony's objections, leaders of the movement agreed to suspend women's rights activities during the Civil War in order to focus on the abolition of slavery. In 1863, we'll find Anthony and Stanton organizing the Women's Loyal National League, the first national women's political organization in the United States. Remarkably, it collected nearly 400,000 signatures on petitions to abolish slavery. It was, in fact, the largest petition drive in the nation's history up to that point. Just unbelievable. But it was not a suffrage organization, but it did make it clear that it stood for the political equality for women. And it indirectly advanced that cause in a number of ways. Stanton would remind the public that petitioning was the only political tool that was really available for women at a time when only men were allowed to vote. This league's impressive petition drive really demonstrated the value of formal organization to the women's movement, which sort of traditionally had been kind of resistant to organized structures, and in many ways it kind of marked a continuation of the shift we have seen of women's activism from sort of persuading people on moral grounds to outright political activism. Its 5,000 members constituted just a widespread network of women's activists who would gain the kind of experience that would help create a real powerful pool of talent for future forms of activism, including suffrage. During the Reconstruction period, Republicans set about to add the 14th and 15th Amendments to the US Constitution. And during the subsequent debates in Congress, the issue of women's right to vote became sort of another sort of major focus in the debate about the right to vote for freed slaves. But interestingly, a number of suffragists strenuously objected to the 14th Amendment, which defined national citizenship and the voting requirements, because it introduced for the first time in the US Constitution the word male. The 15th Amendment, of course, would lay out the legal mechanism for freed African Americans the right to vote, but it did not extend the franchise to women. And the 15th Amendment really sort of marks the beginning of a real split within the suffrage movement into two camps. So there is one faction made up of Lucy Stone and her husband, Henry Blackwell, and prominent Black activists, including Frederick Douglass, who very much supported the 15th Amendment. And they argued vehemently that African American freedmen needed the vote far more urgently than women did. They were very much concerned that the movement towards the suffrage of women might prevent the amendment from actually passing. That was really their greatest concern. But another faction made up of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton called for universal suffrage, and they were very much against the 15th Amendment at that time. Horace Greeley, the famous newspaper editor, told Anthony and Stanton, you know, this is a crucial period for the Republican Party and the life of our nation. I beg you to remember that this is the Negro's hour, and your first duty at this point in time is to go through the state and plead their claims. In 1866, the American Equal Rights Association, or the AERA, was established that supported both the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Its purpose was to campaign for the equal rights of all citizens, especially the rights of suffrage, both for freed Blacks and women. The AERA also set about to introduce another amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would lay out equal rights, voting rights for women. And this would be introduced to the U.S. Senate just a couple of years later. And it would have been the 17th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Actually, not the 17th, but rather the 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. In April of 1867, Lucy Stone and her husband, Henry Blackwell, opened the AERA campaign in the state of Kansas in support of referenda that would enfranchise not only African Americans, but women as well. The AERA attempted to link these issues of Black and women's rights, but a number of feminists were very much disappointed by efforts on the part of Kansas Republicans to support suffrage for Black men only. They went on to form an anti-female suffrage committee to oppose the AERA's efforts. It turned into a very bitter and ugly struggle between the two camps. And in the end, both referenda did go down to defeat. So out of this Kansas struggle, a real rift emerged between those on the one hand who supported universal suffrage and those who believed that Blacks should be given the right to vote first before the issue of women's enfranchisement could be taken up. So, in the wake of the Kansas debacle, again, the AERA divides up into two separate factions, both advocating for universal suffrage, but their political approach would be very different. So, as we've seen, we have Lucy Stone was very much supportive of freed African Americans to achieve the right to vote first, and they maintained, this wing did, maintain very strong ties with the Republican Party and the abolitionists. The other side, however, led by Anthony and Stanton, insisted that women and Black men be enfranchised at the same time and work toward a politically independent women's movement that would no longer be dependent on the abolitionists for financial and other resources. So in 1869, the American Equal Rights Association imploded, and what emerged from the wreckage were two competing women's suffrage organizations that would move forward with their own individual goals.